Alfablot, sacrifice to the elves. It is October, soon to be November, and we are closing in to the time of Halloween, All Saints' Eve, and the Day of the Dead, depending on where in the world you live. Now, all these celebrations have slightly different roots, but also share a lot of roots, I think. They're held after the harvest in the autumn. In the north, that would mean the beginning of the darkest time of the year. And it involved giving offerings of food and drink and honoring supernatural beings. In some places, it is about the dead people and the spirits. And other places, it is, it's a bit hard to know exactly what Halloween was originally about, because there are a lot of symbols both for dead people and for spirit beings. And there is also a Catholic version that was about the saints, basically All Saints' Eve. In any way, in pre-Christian Viking Age Scandinavia, there appears to have been a celebration at the same time of year that could have had some similarities, involving the giving of offerings of food and drink to supernatural beings, in this case, the elves. So, when it comes to sources mentioning Alfablot, we don't have many. We actually only have, we have one contemporary source and one a bit later source, written source. The contemporary source is a Scaldic poem, and Scaldic poems are poems that were composed during the Viking Age by skalds that have names and who we know lived for real. And they are also composed in a bound form, which means that they didn't change when they were being transmitted orally. So the bound poetic form made sure that these stories survived for hundreds of years before they were written down. And they survived in the exact form that we now know them. So these are the oldest literary sources that we do have from the Viking Age, actually. And these Scaldic poems were recorded later on by diverse chroniclers who wrote the sagas, especially the one we have to thank for the preservation of most of the Scaldic poetry is, in fact, Snorri Sturluson. And he is the one who has recorded this Scaldic poem, and who also describes and explains this Scaldic poem in its context. The poem has been recorded within Snorri's Heimskringla saga of Olaf the Holy. And the Scaldic poem that Snorri refers to was composed by the skald, the Icelandic Norwegian skald Sigvat Thoridarson, who lived between 995 and 1045. Sigvat was in service of a king, which was quite common for skalds that day. They usually went into service to some great man or other. And Sigvat, he had chosen to follow Olaf, soon to be called Olaf the Holy. So Sigvat was a Christian, and this religious aspect of him does color some of the way he sees the Alfablot, obviously. He describes it in a humorous but also a bit mocking tone, because it is a pagan ritual that he is describing, and he is not a pagan. He describes this as an outsider. So we know that this poem was, the poem was probably composed sometime before the 1020s, about 1000 years ago exactly. And it was about something that Sigvat experienced in the autumn of 1018. 1003 years ago. So the story goes, and now I read from the Saga, which also includes the Scaldic poem. I read. Then they went through Götaland and arrived in the evening at a farm called Temple, Hof. There the door was closed, and they could not enter. The people in the house said at det var heilagt, that it was sacred there, and they walked away. Sigvat made a poem. I came to the temple on an occasion. The door was locked. I asked from outside, curiously bowing to let my nose peer inside. I hardly got a word in return. They said the place was holy. I bid the giantesses to have them, the heathen people who chased me away. Then he came to another farm. There stood the hus Freyr in the door and said that he could not go in there, for she said that they were having Alfablot, sacrifice to the elves. And Sigvat made a poem. Do not come further in, you poor boy, said the woman. We are heathens. Of Odin's wrath I am fearful. Alfablot, sacrifice to the elves, was there, said the wretched wench. She drove me out without so much as blinking, as if I was a wolf chased from the farm. The next evening, Sigvat came to 3 peasants, and all 3 of them were called Ölvir, bear man, and together they drove him out. Sigvat made a poem. 3 namesakes saw my neck, driving me before them. These lords of swords can hardly demand a lot of appraisal. Now I am fearful, almost, that men by the name of bear man all are those who most often chase away their guests. They moved on again that evening and came to a 4th farmer who was considered to be the best man among the Swedes. But he drove them away too, and Sigvat made a poem. Later I sought the man, the very rich, and called the most friendly of them all. I expected something fair, but the lord of the region glared grumpily at me. If this be the best man, then the worst is bad, and I rarely complain. When they finally reached Ragnvald Jarl, the earl said that he could see that they had had a stressful journey. Sigvat made a poem where he complains about being badly received by the realm's peasants. Ragnvald Earl gave a gold ring to Sigvat. A woman in the hall remarked that the man with the black eyes at least got something back from his journey, and Sigvat made a poem. These black eyes from Iceland, woman, showed us long and steep paths towards this shining ring. This foot of mine, lady, found bravely its way to here, on old path that your husband badly knows. To sum up the story, after a long and tiresome journey, Sigvat and his companions arrived at a homestead, a farming settlement called Hof, which directly translates as temple. And this was probably not coincidental. This was probably the site of the regent's temple. Now, they expected, Sigvat and his men, they expected to be received well, according to the laws of hospitality. So this was what people expected back then. If you went traveling around, unless you had some mark of the outlaw or something, you could expect hospitality. But the doors remained shut. Sigvat had to stick his nose down into a narrow opening in the door in order to present himself. But the people of the household, the temple, refused him by saying at der var heilagt, saying that the place was hallowed, it was made holy. Sigvat retorted that the trolls should take them and continued to the next homestead. But at the following farm, he met a husfrøya. That means the Freya of the house, the lady of the household, or the lady of the settlement. A very high title for a woman. And she told him to go away and said, "Don't go further inside, unlucky man. We are afraid of Odin's wrath. We are pagans." Now, whether she actually said this in this way or another way, we don't know, but it sounds a lot like the way medieval Christians would portray pagans, that they are also afraid of the wrath of their gods, just like the Christians were afraid of their god's wrath. So anyway, it was obviously not allowed to let either a visitor enter, or maybe it was because he was a Christian that he couldn't enter, because they perhaps had some experience that presence of a devoted, newly converted Christian person could be disturbing the rituals. But that's speculation. What is said is that she chased him away as if he were a wolf and said that they were having the sacrifice to the elves at the homestead. So they tried 3 more times to find a place to rest, but all the times they were dispatched by men who called themselves Ölvir, and this title actually means bear man. And the bear man, and since this is happening in connection to a ritual, it may be speculated that this bear man was probably a guardian of the ritual. Sigvat and his men, in desperation, decided to seek out the man who was reputedly the most hospitable man in the district. But the last man only scowled at them, and, calling the man the guardian of the pickaxe, Sigvat stated that if that man was the best man, then the worst man must have been truly evil. As far as we can see from Sigvat's account, the harvest rite of the Alfablot was a time when ordinary rules of hospitality could be put aside in favor of a very private and sacred celebration where outsiders from other settlements could not expect entry. But we don't know this. What we do know is that Sigvat was not allowed to enter, and if Sigvat was wearing a cross or something, it could have been their experience that it would be unwise to let him partake in the ritual. Now, it took place after the harvests, which would mean that it took place towards the end of October and the beginning of November, roughly at the same time as our Halloween. So, what may we learn from Sigvat's account? The story of Sigvat that I just related is told in chapter 92 of the Saga of Olaf the Holy in Snorri's Heimskringla. And this is in fact the only written source that we have where we learn that there was something called an Alfablot. The Alfablot is also mentioned by Sigvat, so that is a contemporary source. So this is probably, well, undoubtedly a real term that people had. There was an Alfablot, a sacrifice to the elves. So the source teaches us a name for the celebration and strongly suggests that it happens at autumn after the harvest time, which places it quite safely round about the same time that middle-aged Christians would later celebrate All Saints' Eve, what has become Halloween in modern English. So this was when the Christians of the medieval times would celebrate all the saints. So again, it was a bit about supernatural beings, sacred beings, perhaps even dead souls, since the saints are dead souls. So we learned that it could have been held at a temple, a hof, but then we also hear that it is held inside the main house of various farms. And the story suggests that the ritual demanded that nobody enter the hallowed place from outside, at least not once the ritual had begun. So as I said, this could mean a lot of things. It could mean that it was a strict family celebration, or that this was only for the people who lived at the settlement, and that people from other places could not enter and not expect the same ordinary hospitality that a traveler usually could. But it could also be about Sigvat being not an insider to the religion. We hear of guardians of the door or of the ritual itself. A guardian of the door or of the ritual appears to have been a single man or men who call themselves bear men. And there is one Husfreyja, the lady of the household, who we assume also led rituals at home, as we know some descriptions of, such as the Völsadotter, which is led by the Husfreyja. The rituals themselves, however, are not described at all. Bummer. But this is where we may see some hints in a couple of other sources. The first example is from Cormac's Saga, chapter 22, where we meet a woman called Thordis spåkona. Thordis the oracle woman, or Thordis the prophet, and she lived at Spåkonufell, the hill of the oracle woman. The chapter gives several examples of Thordis' ability to help and protect men in battle and other things with her great powers. In the context of this article, we shall only look at the latter, where one of the champions who was hurt in a combat situation, Thorvard, discovers that his wound will not heal properly. He asks Thordis if she knows what he must do to properly heal. So I read from the saga. Thorvard healed slowly, and when he could get on his feet, he went to see Thordis and asked her what was best to help his healing. And a hill there is, she answered, not far away from here, where Alfablot, where elves dwell within. Now get you the bull that Cormac killed, and redden the outer side of the hill with its blood, and make a feast for the elves with its flesh. Then you will be healed. So they sent word to Cormac that they would buy the bull. He answered that he would sell it, but then he must have the ring that was Steingart. So they brought the ring, took the bull, and did with it as Thordis bade them do. So this may not be a literal description of a typical seasonal Alfablot, but it could easily be based on cultural memories of how the sacrifice to the elves had to do with sacrificing an animal, in this case a bull, and covering the hill or mound where the elves are thought to live with its blood. It is literally said that they should make this into a feast for the elves, and elves apparently enjoyed fresh blood smeared onto mounds. There is a third tale which may offer some vague indication as to the relationship between the elves and mounds. Not just natural mounds or hills, but also burial mounds and sacrifice, and also, interestingly, to the souls of dead people in such mounds. The story is that of Olaf Geirstad Alfr, Olaf the Elf of Geirstad, and it is referred to in several different sources. One source, the Thotter Olafs Geirstad Elves, let us know that Olafr was a good king and a good person too, and during his reign there was good year and peace. It was something that people held in very high regard. If a king could provide good years and peace, he was very highly honored. If he failed to provide good year and peace over the period of a certain time, he could get sacrificed. But Olafr dreamed a dream about how there was going to be a plague very soon. So Olaf had foresight. He was part elf, actually, and he could see the future. So what he dreamt, he took very seriously. And now he was dreaming that a plague, a pandemic, was about to come. And he also learned in that dream what he had to do in order to save his people. And the story may suggest that the solution was, as it often was, to sacrifice the king, but this is not said directly. What is said is that Olafr gathered the parliament and warned people of his prophecy. He said that a plague was coming, and he bid that they make a huge haugur, a burial mound, and that he would be buried in this mound together with all the important people who were also going to die from this plague. So the haugur, the burial mound, the barrow, was raised, and soon enough the plague reached the land. And just as the king had prophesied, the king and many of his trusted companions did die from the plague, and they were all placed in this mound. And as soon as this mound burial was completed, king and all, the plague magically vanished. And the people sacrificed to the mound ever after and referred to the king as the Elf of Geirstad, Geirstad Alfer. And I read, Och efter dat haugrin apter byrgder, då tog och att lätta mandaudnum. Sidan Geirdi uåran miket och hallari. Var då dat råd tekit att der blotu du Olaf konung till år ser, och kölle du han Geirstad Alf. And in English, and after the mound had been closed, then the great man death, the plague, vanished. But later there were bad crops and famine, and then they reasoned that they should sacrifice to Olafr king for a good year, and they called him the Elf of Geirstad. So we do not know why the king was referred to as an Alfr, an elf, after his death. From the way Snorri describes the elves and the way they appear in Edda poetry, I think it is possible that there was a very vague line between what an elf was and what the soul of a dead man could potentially become after his death. So I'm not saying that the elves are dead souls. I'm saying that it is possible that dead souls, the souls of the dead, could perhaps become like elves in some way or other. But this could also be because Olafr was said to have descended from elves, because the sagas do speak of people who are part elves or descended from elves, and Olafr was said to be part elf through the mother line. So the story of Olafr could suggest that people may have believed that he, already part elf when he lived, possibly turned into a proper elf as soon as he was mound laid. Anyway, the Elf of Geirstad was also a dead king's soul at the same time. So there is an overlapping here. And this is suggested in a different source, the Saga of Olaf the Holy again, but this time the Saga of Olaf the Holy in Flatøyarbok, because there are more sagas of Olaf the Holy. So this is the other Saga of Olaf the Holy. And here we learn that the young Christian king, Olaf, who was the grandnephew of Olaf the Elf, well, he had passed the mound of his ancestor and claimed to be Olafur Enderborin, that is, Olafur reincarnated, meaning that he thought that the elf of Geirstad had been reborn as himself, as Olafur, soon to be called Olaf the Holy. So later in life, Olaf the Holy is confronted with this rumor when he has become older and more powerful, and obviously also more schooled in his own Christian religion, because here he states that he never, as far as he could remember, never claimed to have been a reincarnation of Geirstad Olaf, and that the very notion, he adds, of reincarnation was a pagan superstition. So this is one of the stories suggesting that reincarnation may have been one out of several after-death options in the pagan religion. And Olaf the Holy, the man who is credited with having brought Christianity properly into Norway and converted the whole country, at least after his death, when he was made a saint. When he was young, he had not been as educated in the religion that he was trying to convert people into, and he believed that he was a reincarnation of his grand uncle Olaf from Geirstad, the elf. So here we see that there could have been connections, that the souls of dead people, even souls who are reincarnated later, could have been identified as elfen in some way or other. Anyway, another interesting hint in the story of the elf of Geirstad is the sacrifice til års, for a good year crop, for a good harvest, a good year basically, but that means a good fertile year crop. Enough food, basically. This was the kind of sacrifice that the elf in the mound, the elf of Geirstad, was supposedly able to help the living with. The elf of Geirstad, sacrificed to while in his mound, was supposed to be able to help people with good crops, peace, and the healing from plagues. Interestingly, this function is very similar to that of Freyr and the Vanir. They too are frequently portrayed as receivers of sacrifice til års, and for good crop, and for peace, and for healing. It is interesting to note that Freyr is said to be the owner of Alfheimr, the world of the Elves, and this is said in the Edda poem Grimnismål, stanza 5. So this is, the Grimnismål is an Edda poem, and the Edda poems are today, after a lot of discussions over the decades, they are generally thought to date back to the late Viking age, probably composed by pagan people themselves, but in a time where Christianity was looming over them. So anyway, there may have been some connection here between the elves and the Vanir, unless, of course, this connection is due to some later confusion between what an elf or a Vanir may have been. But in our day, I see that people are extremely concerned about terms and categories, and while when I read the old text, the Old Norse text, terms are frequently overlapping, and people appear to have been a lot more fluid about categories that time. An elf could be something else too. An elf could be an elf, but an elf could be a Vanir, an elf could be a god, an elf could be a dead man's soul even. So I think people didn't think in these boxed categories that we are used to thinking in. Anyway, let us summarize the sources. The image that I draw based on these sources is that the sacrifice to the elves may refer to diverse sacrifices involving elves as recipients of prayers for health and abundance, or to an annual autumn celebration that was practiced by everybody in a region in autumn after the harvest, close in time to the later Christian Allehelgensaften, All Saints' Eve, which corresponds in time and partly also in theme with Halloween and the Day of the Dead. So whether this correspondence is coincidental or not, I cannot say. Maybe they all descend from some older late autumn rituals that was about honoring and appeasing and perhaps asking the aid of supernatural beings who were particularly active during the dark time and hoping that they would help them get a good year to come. A good year with lots of crops and stuff, and peace, and no plagues. The sacrifice, based on these sources, may have involved making a feast for the elves. It may have involved beer, since we have beer men guarding the ritual. It may have involved meat and blood, and sacrifice, obviously. Blot means sacrifice, and it is very likely that an animal was sacrificed here and that the meat and the blood was in some way or other served to the elves. Some of the ritual would be held indoors and only be open for the participants, either because they had family ties or because they had residential ties or simply religious ties to the place in which the ritual was held. It could also have been held inside a temple, as we hear about, a hof, or, as we also hear about, it could be held outside, at a hill, or a mound, or even a burial mound, a cairn, in which it was believed that the elves dwelled. It involved, obviously, a sacrifice, and blood may have been smeared onto the altar or onto the elfin dwelling, which could have been a hill or a mound. There may possibly have been a connection with the souls of the dead and with the elves, not that I'm saying that they are exactly the same, but that they could be connected to each other. But of this we have a little more to build on. But we could look a bit more on how elves generally appear in the sources. And the elves are often mentioned in Edda poetry, but it is very rare that they actually play a role. So I'm going to look elsewhere. In the saga of Rolf Kraki, we meet Rolf's half-sister, Skuld. Skuld is married to a regional king, Jörvarder, and he was one of the vassal kings beneath Rolf Kraki. And Rolf Kraki had become the king of Denmark. So he was sort of like the great king, and then beneath him there were regions ruled by smaller kings, chiefs, hövdingar, or people call them different things. But in any case, this king, Jörvar, was a vassal king beneath Rolf, who was the king of Denmark. And the king of Denmark ruled from the ancient royal seat of Leire. And that is the same, this is a real archaeological site place, and still a town called Leire in Denmark. And it is the same place that is mentioned in, say, Beowulf, the story of Beowulf. That's where Leire is the royal house that is being haunted by Grendel in Beowulf. But this is from a time a bit later than Beowulf, I think. Anyway, on their father's side, both Skuld and Rolf descended from the royal dynasty of the Skjöldungar. The Skjöldungar are known from Beowulf as the Skylfings, and they believed that they were descended from Odin's son, Skjöld, and from the goddess Gefjon. The goddess was the creator of the island Zealand in Denmark, where you find Copenhagen and things. In any case, Rolf and Skuld had the same Skjoldunga father, but they had different mothers. And Skuld, she was descending from the Elves through her motherline. In chapter 47 of the Saga of Rolf Kraki, we learn that Skuld envied her half-brother's position and decided to incite her husband against him. So basically, she incites her husband to rebellion and thus to treachery against the High King, her brother. And here we may read, Skuld was the greatest of Galdrakind. Galdrakind, that was sorceresses, basically performers of spell songs. So she was the greatest of Galdrakind, and she had come out of elves through her motherline. And for this, Rolf King and his champions would suffer. But let us just stop there. She had come out of elves through her motherline, and this made her invincible. Because of this, Rolf would suffer. So in chapter 48, Skuld and her husband assemble an army against the king. And because of her sorcery, their army remains hidden as they approach, while Rolf and his champions are unable to perceive that the enemy is gathering and approaching. I read, This treachery remained hidden so that Rolfr King was unaware of it, and neither could his champions perceive this, since this concealment was done with the most powerful Galdrar and deeds. Galdrar and deeds, that Galdrar och gärningar, this is a formula that is mentioned all the time in the sagas. That means that you are doing witchcraft in some way or other. Galdrar och gärningar, spell songs and deeds. Skuld, in order to overpower her brother Rolf King, used here the most powerful Seider, so that following her were elves and Norns and other intolerable misbehaviors, so that human natures could not stand up to their power. So basically, this is a woman who obviously knows Seider and Galdrar. She is a fjölkyngiskona. She knows a lot. She has a lot of powerful Seider, and this makes her, she actually makes supernatural beings, we would possibly say spirits. She summoned them, she conjured them to follow her and help her in battle. And in this text, these spirits are directly described as elves and Norns. Alfar och norner och annat otöluligt illthydig. Otöluligt illthydig, that means intolerable misbehaviors. So basically either people who are condemned by the chroniclers or other sort of horrible spirits apart from Norns and elves. Now, of course, this has been written down later by people who were Christian, and it is possible that they had sort of invented this thing about her conjuring elves and Norns and other horrible beings. It says that they were so powerful that no human nature, manligt natura, cannot stand up to their powers. In any case, that's what the text says, that she conjured elves and Norns and other beings to her service. And with this help, she wins, actually. When Rolfr and his men finally figured out that they are being attacked during their happy Yule celebration, when they least expected it, full of drink and food, it is too late. They fight bravely, but they cannot stand against the supernatural forces wielded by Skuld. And for a while, only a magical bear, which appears to be a form of the king's champion, Bodvar Bjarki, seems to give the king's men some hope. So they have a little bit of magic on their side. There is this champion called Bodvar Bjarki who can appear as a bear in the battle, and because of this bear, they are able to fight for a while. So in chapter 52, we read that Rolf and his men were attacked now by a Galdra reed, a storm of Galdrar, as in spell songs. Now came such a Galdra reed, a Galdra storm, upon them that the champions started to fall, one after the other. And Rolf emerged from the shield wall and was nearly dead from exhaustion. No more words are needed. There, Rolf King fell with all his champions, all with great glory. So, in the Saga literature, we sometimes come across the notion of human beings with elfin lineage. So, I have already mentioned Skuld, and I have mentioned Olaf the Elf. Both of them were part elves through their mother lineages. So according to the Ynglinga Saga and the Saga of Halfdan the Black in Heimskringla, the kingdom of Vestfold laid in generational conflict and war with the people who lived to the eastern side of the fjord, corresponding to present-day Østfold. I always thought this was a bit funny because my mother came from Østfold and my father from Vestfold, and they're really just regions on either side of the fjord. You can look over to the other side. And it's a bit odd to think that these two regions on either side of the Oslo fjord or the Viking fjord were actually waging war for generations between each other. Anyway, as we hear in these sagas, this place, which now is called Østfold, was in fact called Alfheimr, the world of the Elves. And this realm was ruled by a king called Gandalfir. Yes, indeed, this book of Snorri's was where Tolkien got the name Gandalf from. And it appears that the conflict between the eastern, the elfin part, and the western, Vestfold part of the fjord may have been about control of the region known as Vingulmark, the impenetrable forest, which corresponds to what is now known as Oslo and Akershus. This was an ancient oak forest, and it was said that only light elves dwelled there. Women from Alfheimr appear in saga and legend, usually by the name of Alfhilder, which means elf battle, and Alfsol, elf sun. And they had a history of marrying kings from either Denmark or Vestfold. The elves in mythology. According to Snorri Sturluson, there were two kinds of alfar. The Døkk alfar, the dark elves, and the Ljos alfar, light elves. The light elves were shining and glorious like the sun and existed in the two uppermost heavens, after the 9 worlds listed by Snorri or listed in the Grimnismål. So you have 9 worlds listed, and then it is said that Hel, death, rules in 9 worlds. And from the way it is described, I think that it could possibly mean that the world of the light elves are worlds where Hel does not rule. They are worlds of the immortals. And it is more or less said that the light elves are immortal and very, very high, løfter. So one interesting aspect of the following quote from the Gylfaginning is that the place in the upper heavens where the good, righteous and treachery-free souls of people are going to survive Ragnarok and dwell forever in eternal bliss and immortality. Well, this glorious realm of immortality is only inhabited by light elves. And this is not the first time we see some sort of overlap between the concepts of dead souls and the concept of elves. I would also add that while many think this concept of a blissful, immortal existence in some upper heaven is a Christian influence, but it is a fact that such concepts of a glorious afterlife in some upper heaven did exist in many pagan religions for hundreds and hundreds of years before Christianity was even conceived of. For example, in the many mystery religions that held wide influence in the world for thousands of years before Christianity, and these were religions, pagan polytheist religions, or perhaps more pantheist religions in any case, they also spoke of salvation from death, from Hades basically. Now, I have earlier seen similarities between the initiation myths of the Edda poems and the initiation stories of mystery religions. But let us now read what the Gylfaginning says about the upper heavens, those that belong to the just souls after Ragnarok and also belonging to the light elves. I read. Chapter 17, Main Settlements of the Gods. Höfudstadir godarna. Then said Gangleri, you can tell many tidings about the heavens. What other main settlements exist apart from the Well of Origin? The High One says, there are many wonderful places in heaven. One settlement is called Alfheimr, Elf World. There live the people who are called Ljosalfar, light elves, while the dark elves, the Dökkalfar, live beneath the earth. And these two sorts of elves are very different to look at and even more different in character. The light elves are fairer to look at than the sun, while the dark elves are blacker than tar. So they are really dark. Intermission here, they discuss the higher heavens and how all worlds will perish during Ragnarok except for the place called Gimle. And Gimle will stand forever when everything else is broken, and is where only good and righteous people without treachery will dwell in immortal and eternal existence. And I read, then said Gangleri, how is this place, Gimle, saved when the fires of Surtur burn up heaven and earth? Because the fires of Surtur, the Soothing One, will burn up heaven and earth during Ragnarok. So how come Gimle survives? And the High One says, it is said that there is another heaven to the south and above this one, which is called long breath, andlanger, or prolonged spirit. And a third heaven above this again, which is called wide death, vid, blåin. Blåin, that actually means the blue one, but that is a very common metaphor for the dead. So vid could mean wood death, or wide death, I think. And it is in this heaven that we believe that this place, Gimle, lies, but we think that there are only light elves who live here. Apart from this, the elves play very passive roles in the mythical stories, but according to the Lokasenna, they do sit at the banquet at the end of the universe with the sea giant Aegir. And this is a place where gold brightens up the hall and the ale serves itself, and the place is called Hlesey, the wind-shielded island. And I have, in many other places, often reasoned why wind functions as a metaphor in Norse poetry, a metaphor for death and mortality, and that whatever is breezeless or wind-shielded is a theme of immortality. The dark elves, the Dökkalfar, are different. They are dark and swarthy and dwelling underground, and they are crafty, and in their descriptions may be almost indistinguishable from dwarfs or from the later Huldrefolk in Norwegian folklore, and perhaps of the Alfar as they have been remembered in Icelandic folklore. There is one Edda poem that appears to be about an elf, namely the Völundarkvida. Here we meet three brothers, Völundur, Slagfidr, and Egil, who are said to be the sons of the Finnish king. And that would usually actually mean the Sami king in Norse sources, because Finnish associations are typically about magically versed people and usually about what we today call Sami people. Now these three sons of the Finnish or the Sami king come to a valley where they find three Valkyries in swan hides, and they are spinning the threads of fate. Each brother gets married to a Valkyria, and they live happily together for 7 years. Then, during the 8th year, the Valkyries want to travel and fulfill their fates, and the 9th year they disappear, flying away from their husbands. Two of the brothers start searching desperately for their wives in other places, while Verlund stays put, forging many rings of red gold while he awaits the return of his beloved. But then, while he is forging the rings of red gold and waiting the return of his Valkyria bride, Verlund's abode is invaded by a terrible king who hamstrings the ringsmith, Verlund, and keeps him captive on an islet where he is forced to forge riches for the king and his family. And with his great fjöl, kyngi, his great knowledge, his great magical, spiritual knowledge, Verlund extracts a terrible revenge and punishment. And this is when he is referred to as a wise elf, vis alfr, an elf whose shape changes into an eagle and flies away victorious. So this could have been the story of an elf called Völundur. As to Völunder, what that means, there are some versions of this story in other sources where Völundur is called things like Velander or Wayland. Ve would then mean shrine, and lander means land, obviously, so shrine, land. But in the Norse version, he's called Völundur. So the lund is not like the land. Lund means grove, and vö, unless this is something, unless it was originally ve, which means that it could have mean the grove of shrines. Völ could also mean the staff, the wand of the völva, the völ. So this could be the grove of the wand. In any case, this was a story that perhaps involves an elf being the protagonist of the story. And nobody, it is said, nobody can stand up to the elf, to this wise elf. Now, the word alfr is by definition masculine. It's like the word norn is by definition feminine, so you don't find male norns, in the same way you don't find actually female elves, but we do hear of female entities who are related to the elves. The sun goddess is often called Alfrödull, which means the splendor of the elves. The goddess Idun is said to be Alfakindar, of elf kind, in Rafnagalderodin, stanza 6. And in the Edda poem Fafnismål, stanza 12 and 13, we learn that the Norns come in various forms. Some are of divine stock, others are of elfin stock, and yet others are of dwarf kind. I read. Sigurdur said, "Tell me this, Fafnir, as it is said you are wise, and that you know much. Who are those Norns who come to those in need, and who choose mothers for children?" Fafnir said, "Born of much diversity, I think that the Norns are. They do not come from a singular lineage. Some are the children of the Aesir, some are of elf kind, and some are the daughters of hibernation." The Edda poem Alvismål is another poem where the elves feature as representatives for different worlds in the cosmos. And it is about how they perceive the same things in nature, alongside giants, dwarfs, gods, and humans, how they perceive the same things in different ways, according to their own nature or to the nature of their realm or dimension, perhaps. And I'm just going to read some of these verses here. Stanza 10. Jordur, earth, she is called among men, and with the Aesir, land. She is path among the Vanir, evergreen to the giants, growing to the elves. The high powers call her mud sand. Heaven he is called among men, and sibling lights with the gods. Wind weaver among the Vanir, world above to the giants. To the elves the beautiful roof, to dwarfs the dripping hall. Moon he is called among men, and waning among the gods, whirling wheel in hell. Hastene among giants, shine among dwarfs, the elves call him year counter. Sol she is called among men, and Sunna among the gods, to the dwarfs hibernation's lover. Eternal glow to the giants, beautiful wheel to the elves, all transparent to the sons of the Aesir. Clouds they are called among men, rain hope with the giants, wind floaters among the Vanir, original hope with the giants, wind power with the elves, in Hel the concealing helmet. Wind he is called among men, and waving with the gods, neighing among the sacred rulers, howling to the giants, to the elves sound traveller, in Hel the storm maker. What is that calm called that shall descend in all the worlds? Calm it is called among men, light with the gods, wind end with the Vanir, too hot for the giants, end of day to the elves, peace of day to the dwarfs. Sea he is called among men, illusion among the gods, wave among the Vanir, ale world to the giants, staff of laws to the elves, dripping steed to the dwarfs. Forest it is called among men, mane of hills among gods, rock seaweed among people, timber among giants, beautiful twig to the elves, wand to the Vanir. Night she is called among men, darkness among gods, disguiser among the sacred powers, unlight to the giants, sleep pleasure to the elves, dream goddess to the dwarfs. And here I finish. Happy Alfablot, happy Halloween, or happy whatever autumn celebration you wanted to make. Goodbye. Thor kvad, seg du mer datt alvis, øll og frauk fira, vårom dverger at viter. Vesu gjørd heiter, ligger fyr alda sonum, heim I verjom I. Alvis kvad, gjørd heiter med monnum, enn med åsom fold, kalla vega vaner, igrøn jotnar, alfar groandi, kalla aur uppregi. Himin heiter med mannum, en hlirner med godom, kalda vindoffni vaner, uppheim jötnar, alfar fagra refer, dvergar drjopans sal. Måni heiter med mannum, en mylin med godom, kalla verfanda väl heljo I. Skyndig jötnar, en skin dvergar, kalla alfar årtala. Sol heiter med monnum, en sunna med godom, kalla dvergar dvalins leika. Øyglo jötnar, alfar fagra väl, allskir åsa syner. Sky heiter med monnum, en skurvan med godom, kalla vindflot vaner, urvån jotnar, alfar vädermägen, kalla I heljo jalm hulit. Vinder heiter med monnum, en våvoder med godom, kalla gneggtjod ginregin, opi jötnar, alfar dynfara, kalla I heljo vidud. Thor kvad, seg du mer datt alvis, oll og frauk fira, vårom dverger at viter. Ved at logn heiter ligga skal, heimi verjom I. Alvis kvad, logn heiter med mannen, en logi med godom, kalla vindslåt vaner, ofly jötnar, alfar dags eva, kalla dvergar dagsvero. Sær heiter med mannum, en sileiga med godom, kalla våg vaner, ålheim jötnar, alfar lagastaf, kalla dvergar djupan mar. Vider heiter med mannum, en vallar fax med godom, kalla lithang haler, eldig jötnar, alfar fagerlima, kalla vönd vaner. Thor kvad, seg du mer datt alvis, øll og frauk fira, vårom dverger at viter. Ves vår nøtt heiter, en narfi kenda, heimi verjom I. Alvis kvad. Alvis kvad, nøtt heiter med mannum, en njål med godom, kalla grimo inregen, oljos jötnar, alfar sveffengaman, kalla dvergar draumnjör.